Welcome to this video. Today I'm talking with David Gerrelli, who lives in Dallas in Texas, USA. We will be talking about hellish near-death experiences and how some of the experiences were able to get away from those horrible situations. My first question for you, David, when and why did you start dealing with this topic?
Dangerous. Well, thank you for having me. It's good to be here. So it's a really good question. I get asked that question quite frequently. So I personally haven't had a near-death experience, and people that have had near-death experiences, they all share an intimate knowledge of what that means. So as an outsider, as somebody that hasn't had that experience, I was particularly intrigued to understand what is it like? You know, does it answer some of these fundamental questions for us? And as a young child, I personally had a lot of problems with the concept of death. And I used to suffer from panic attacks, quite serious ones, when I was younger, once I understood what death was. And I started to read about NDEs, and this was a long time ago, like 25, 30 years ago. And it was Dr. Moody's book, The Light Beyond, which was his second book, that kind of was my gateway drug into near-death experiences. And as I started to study near-death experiences, I started to learn that there was this concept of hellish near-death experiences. And as I got older, and I kind of didn't do very much on the NDE front for a long time. And then as I got into my kind of late 30s and I had a child of my own, and he asked me the question about what happens when we die. But also he asked me, you know, is there a hell? And I'd had these questions before from other people. And I decided to look into it. And I have a background in data science and data statistical analysis and data analysis. And there are thousands upon thousands of near-death experience reports out there, both from the Near-Death Research Foundation and from the International Association for Near-Death Experiences. So there is a huge abundance of data. But actually from a hellish, distressing point of view, the number of reports are quite low. So whilst there are hundreds of books on positive NDEs, as there should be, there are a very limited number of books on hellish NDEs. And I didn't have access to a summary of why does someone have a hellish NDE? Is there a hell? If there is, what happens when you go there? Can you escape from hell? I couldn't answer any of these questions with existing literature. So I decided to do my own research and came across some very compelling and very decisive answers in terms of some of these questions. And that's what led me to write the book. And it was only after 2 or 3 years of research that I actually decided to even write a book. I mean, initially it was just my own investigations, but I felt that I discovered something important, which most people that have had a distressing NDE already know the answer to these questions. But I felt for the rest of us, it was important to know these things. It's a question that affects everybody. And therefore, I thought it was important that everybody knew, based on the data available from the millions of people that have this experience and the thousands of reports, that people were aware of some of these conclusions.
And roughly how many cases have you investigated yourself?
So the number of distressing experiences is relatively low. And I think it's an important point to make as well. So of all the NDEs worldwide, and of those reported, there are tens of thousands. Of those unreported, there are tens of millions, perhaps hundreds of millions in some regions of the world. But the percentage of hellish experiences is somewhere between 4 to 15% of all near-death experiences are in some way distressing. It doesn't necessarily include hell. There are various ways that an NDE can be distressing. My book does focus specifically on hell and demons, because that's kind of where many of these NDEs lead. So I investigated. I didn't unfortunately have access to the individuals that had these experiences. And because it was a data-based research program as opposed to an interviewing program, my next book involves interviewing people. But for this particular book, it was very much focused on the data, because talking to people can be subjective. People have their own opinions. And I didn't want the book to become a kind of theological in any way. I didn't want it to be kind of biased on anyone's opinions or anyone's views. So I just focused on the raw data. I compared all of the different experiences. And of that, I had probably about, and there's not many, I mean, anybody that looks for distressing NDEs, which is why there's not many books on this subject, because it's really hard to find data. most people that have these distressing experiences don't report it because they feel ashamed, or they're frightened of what could happen to them if they talk about it, or they just think that people will think they're crazy. So distressing NDEs are one of the most unreported of all of the near-death experiences. And I encourage anybody watching to report their NDEs, either to myself or the NDEF, the Near-Death Research Foundation, or IANS, the International Association of Near-Death Experiences. But to answer your question, in totality, I had a sample of about 200 to 300 cases, which I could pull from. But the book contains maybe 15 or 20. I didn't do, it's a lot of data. And the whole point of statistical analysis is to use the Grayson scale, which is a very common mechanism for measuring if an experience is an NDE or just a hallucination. So hallucinations are very common in critical care situations. So it's important to have a scientific metric for determining if an experience is indeed an NDE, and apply it. So I used that Grayson scale to apply that across all of the cases I looked at, and then I pulled out what I believe, based on the analysis and based on that metric for NDEs, I pulled out the ones that I believe to be most accurate, most descriptive, and provided the most obvious answers. And all of that is detailed extensively in the book. So when people read it, they come on that journey, reading the research that I went through with my summaries and my conclusions.
Now, it is noticeable with negative NDEs that they mostly turn into positive redeeming experiences. But are there also NDEs that are entirely negative, meaning no positive element?
Yes, there are. And they're in the book as well. And the reason typically is because they end abruptly. And every NDE typically has some purpose. Well, every NDE has a purpose. And distressing NDEs are no different. Most of them do end up positive. And it's hard, particularly for people that have been indoctrinated into any religion. Most religions teach that hell is eternal. So it's hard to understand. So anybody reading this book should come at it from as much as possible with an open mindset, and not look at it as a belief-based read, but more of a research-based read. And it's not a white paper. So there are people that, vast majority of the times, come away with positive components, where they transition into a positive experience for various different reasons, and each person is different, which is the case with every single NDE. While there are overwhelmingly consistent components of the experience, every single one is still unique. In terms of distressing, there are cases where people's near-death experience, the distressing near-death experience, ended negatively. Now, typically it's because they were returned to their body, well, in fact, that's always the case. So it may well have been there's two possible. I don't really go into this too much in the book, so it's a really interesting question. But I believe there's two possibilities, right? There's always a point of no return when it comes to an NDE, and in many cases, a witness will be prevented from passing that point of no return if it was always intended that they should return back to Earth, back to their bodies, because they have unfinished work, right? As they say. But in some cases, experiences, witnesses, as I call them, are given a choice. You can either stay or you can go back. And in most cases, they'll be shown visions or experiences, more like an imprint of what their family members will feel if they were to die. So they get given a sense, particularly if they have children, this is how your children will feel if you decide to stay here in heaven. So a lot of people get a choice. With distressing NDEs, there's no such choice. There's no situation where an entity or a demon, if you want to call it that, would say to a witness, do you want to stay or do you want to go? So it's always forced. So yeah, there are both scenarios. Sometimes they're entirely distressing, not uncommon, but most of the times, at least based on my sample of data, they do end up being positive, which is important.
And what are the typical elements of negative NDEs? Can you roughly describe how these elements are experienced?
Yeah, I mean, and I'll go into this in the book quite a lot, actually, because there's some very interesting things that draw a stark difference between a negative NDE and a positive NDE. And it also tells you a bit about why you would be in hell in the first place, in terms of what happens to you and the process you go through at the point of death. And it doesn't always have to be death, by the way. Lots of NDEs occur before the physical body is actually completely cardiac arrest, before they completely stop breathing. Sometimes it happens during a tragic accident, but not always at the end of that tragic accident. So for positive NDEs, one of the things that you typically hear is that when somebody transitions out of their body, so when they have that out-of-body experience with a positive NDE, they typically describe that they don't have a physical being. That's very common, where even if they look at their hands, they sometimes see energy. So a very yellow golden light is very common that they see coming from themselves and also from other beings that they encounter. For negative hellish NDEs, typically they retain their physical form. I mean, completely. That was very surprising to me. I've heard the way the senses operate between the negative and the positive is in the positive, you sometimes hear about music, you sometimes hear about certain senses, so sights, but you don't hear much about the smell of things, which was surprising to me. But distressing NDEs, particularly when it involves hell, people describe the smell of burning flesh, sulfur, they describe pain, they always retain their physical body. In many a case, a large percentage of NDEs start in a place called the void, which in the book I call the nexus. And it's a completely black, dark place, but it's not typically frightening for somebody having a positive experience. But for distressing experiences, you tend to fall physically from this space. And that can happen at any point during experience, because there's various reasons why somebody would even have an NDE, distressing NDE in the first place. So the biggest difference is the physicality of the experience. I mean, there's some pretty horrific torture that occurs. And another very important, absolutely vital thing to remember if anybody ever finds himself in a situation, when you communicate in the afterlife, the spiritual realm, heaven, whatever you want to call it, but let's say the spiritual realm, when you communicate, in that realm, typically people say telepathic, but telepathic is also not entirely accurate because it's more of an impression. With telepathy, it's still the communication of words, whereas with NDEs, it's a communication of experience as well. You don't need to have a full conversation telepathically. You just instinctively understand from that person's experience. They imprint what they want you to know onto you. So in a positive experience, that happens quite quickly. As soon as you meet a positive entity, you almost immediately start to communicate with this telepathic imprint. Whereas with hellish, there's none of this telepathy. I mean, they may communicate to you in words telepathically, but they never imprint, because in one of the most common themes, particularly of evil and in any of the distressing realms and in hell, is that entities there will lie to you. There's a famous saying that the hurt wants to hurt, or the hurting wants to hurt. And this is very true. This is overwhelmingly the case. When people come close to hell or the hellish, or they're experiencing that hellish NDE, they describe how they can feel an overwhelming sense from these entities that exist in this demonic place, in this evil place, wanting them to feel their pain and feel their suffering. So it's almost like there's they find some sense of relief in others sharing their pain and sharing their agony and their torture. So there are huge differences between positive and negative. And so to summarize, physicality is a huge difference. Communication is different. And you would never be afraid. Like, as soon as you enter into a positive NDE, you are absolutely consumed by acceptance and love and light. You don't want to go. I mean, it's the most amazing thing to happen to any human being. Like, in their entire, nothing in life can compare to it. But for hellish NDEs, it's completely the opposite. It's terrifying. It's horrifying from the outset. As soon as you smell those smells and you hear those screams, it's pretty much downhill from there, unless you're able to break out that situation to a positive NDE, or obviously return back to your body.
Could you see a trend as to which type of people mostly have such negative experiences? How were these people mostly in their mortal life prior to this experience? Do they have anything in common?
So this is the really complicated part of this entire situation. The answer is yes, there are things that people have in common, but it's not what you would think. So statistically, people that commit suicide, for example, that take their own lives, most studies have proven that only about half of the people that commit suicide actually have a distressing NDE. So it's not like, I mean, most theology, most religions would teach you that anybody that commits suicide would go to hell. But the data doesn't say that. The data says opposite. I mean, the opposite, the data says 50-50. So in terms of what you've done in your life, the kind of person you are, all these things aren't necessarily, whether you committed crime, whether you went to prison, none of these are factors for determining if you go to hell. And this is where the book, that's why you need a book to explain it, because it's, I wouldn't say it's complicated, but it needs explaining. So the reason people go to hell is because, and it's hard to accept this, because they choose to, but not consciously. Nobody would consciously say, I want to go to hell. But the thing is, when we come to earth, and I won't get into the details of how we come to earth, but just let's just say for argument's sake, when we come to earth, we have a very specific path laid out for us. What we do know is that no baby is evil. No child was ever born wanting to commit genocide or do anything evil, right? So I think we can all agree that children are quite innocent. So why would, for example, any genocidal or homicidal person end up being that way? Well, the answer to that question is environmental. It's their life, right? It's the things they've experienced. It could be mental health, but whatever environmental factors or physiological factors that relate to that is something. They didn't come to earth that way. They were made that way whilst they were here. Now, as they go through this process, and this is true for all of us, we don't have to be homicidal or genocidal to have this. As we move through our lives, we start our lives innocent, in terms of positive, right? Children are positive. They've got no reason to be negative. But as we grow and as we move through life, we start to pick up negative aspects. So, and these negative aspects include things like hate, so hatred, and also a really important one is guilt, feeling guilty. So really any negative component that creates, and you hear this a lot when you look at NDEs, the concept of negativity and positivity. You might have heard the word vibration as well. So as you move through life, you collect these positive and negative aspects. You didn't have those when you arrived here. So when you come to the end of your life, you're carrying a lot of that negativity. Well, you're carrying all of that negativity you've collected. Now, not everybody does. It is possible, and I'm hoping people that read the book are able to do this. It is possible to ultimately forgive yourself. Most importantly, is to forgive yourself for the things that you perceive what you've done. In the book, overwhelmingly, and the book covers this, what you see is when somebody has a distressing NDE, is because they expected to. And actually a culprit of this, ironically, is religion, where they teach you that you're a bad person because you don't do X, Y, and Z, or because you have relationships that don't conform to our religion, or you don't behave in a way that conforms to the way that our religion teaches you. So people have that ingrained into their psyche, and it becomes a very negative weight, a very negative energy on them. And when they come to that point where they're passing over, they believe, and free will is a power in itself. Right? It's really important to understand that no one makes a decision for you. No one decides where you're going to go. You always decide that yourself, subconsciously. So when you get to that point, if you believe that you belong in hell, or you believe that you're not worthy of God's love, or you're not worthy of the light, or you're not worthy of heaven, if you believe these things, then it will be so. And that's a really important thing to understand. It's really important to forgive ourselves. And one of my favorite sayings, and I live by this, is there is nothing that you can do that will make God love you less. And this is where religion and NDEs and spiritualism really start to come head to head, and they fundamentally disagree on this concept that God, and every single person that's had an NDE, a positive NDE, knows this without a shadow of a doubt. There's no question that God would never hurt you or any human being, any soul, ever, under any circumstances. There is nothing you can do where he would punish you. So how do you end up in hell? Well, it's the negativity. If you're consumed by hatred and self-guilt, and then you come to the end of your life and you go through your life review and you can't process the guilt and the hatred, you can't take it into heaven, right? You can't take all of this negative. You can imagine it, and I use an analogy in a book as like an oil spill, right? Imagine you've got a beautiful, pristine blue ocean and it's filled with sludge and oil. That's what negativity is, the oil. and the pristine blue ocean is heaven. You can't put your negativity into heaven. You didn't have it when you were there before, and you can't take it back. So there's only one place, and this is what I also believe, and I don't go into I do discuss this in the book, but I believe that hell is almost a human creation, because, and then there are many examples of this that I get into in the book. There's a concept called an egregore, and it's quite common, and it was the Freemasons actually that came up with this concept back in the 17th century. And the concept is that, and there's also another concept called the law of attraction. So if you take the law of attraction and the concept of an egregore is a thought form. So it's effectively a manifestation of people's thoughts or emotions. If you get enough people together, and this happens in human history, right? When people take sides, particularly in war, they form what's called an egregore, right? The good versus the evil, like both sides think they're good and think the other side is evil. So they form these egregores of belief. They manifest. I mean, it's happening right now in all countries and all, different, like far left, far right. These are egregores where people share the same thoughts. So when we pass over, this egregore, that hell is an egregore, right? So it's this concept where all this negativity that people brought with them when they finally died, they can't take it into heaven. It's got to go somewhere. So it creates this egregore. If you think of scales, right? If your negativity, if you can't let go of your negativity and it outweighs your positivity, where is it going to go? The law of attraction says that positive is attracted to positive and negative is attracted to negative. So that's why people are attracted to hell. And so it's that's why I wrote a book. It's a very complicated subject. But ultimately, how you behave is far less important, although how you treat people is vitally important. It's whether you can forgive yourself when that time comes. And it's whether you can let go of your guilt and your hatred. And the answer is you can. And even if you can't, there's still ways to avoid this situation.
And is it also possible that, let's say, good and positive people have negative or hellish NDEs? And if yes, why?
Maybe they have guilt. Maybe they feel guilty about something, right? I mean, actually, they're probably more prone to it, right? Because if you have a preconception of good, like what is good, right? It means that you do everything perfectly, you never hurt anybody. You're human, I'm human, we're flawed. We come to this planet to learn how to overcome those flaws and how to be better souls in the long run. So you're expected to make mistakes. You're expected to persevere. If you come to this planet and you're a good person and you never do anything wrong, what have you learned? You've learned nothing, right? So good people, the challenge would be, and I'm not saying people shouldn't be good, absolutely they should, but people, more importantly, they should accept that it's okay to make mistakes. And I think most people are good. I truly believe that the vast majority of people, even during their lives, when they struggle, when they have such horrible things happen in their lives, I believe that most people are good. But if you're told that what you're doing is bad and you're a good person, that starts to build guilt, self-guilt, self-loathing, and also a sense of unworthiness. That's the worst thing that you can do. The worst thing that we can do is feel that we're unworthy. The worst thing we can do is be consumed by our guilt. No matter what we've done, and I mean no matter what we've done, have to forgive ourselves before our time comes. It's fine if we don't, like people don't know this. This is why the book exists. This is why we're talking about it, so people know. But good or bad, it doesn't matter. That we're all good. Like we all came to this earth good, and ultimately when we're done and we're dead and we pass over, we'll be good again, regardless of how bad we got. So we're all good. I think good people are great, but most of us aren't perfect, to be honest. All religions are kind of, the number of people that are religious is falling dramatically around the world. But people are still good, right? I don't think it's necessary to have religious beliefs to be good. But to answer your question, I think, yes, good people are more likely to go through with no problems, right? If they've done nothing wrong in their lives, as long as they don't feel guilty. Because if you know you're a good person, someone tells you're a good person, and then you do something which you perceive to be bad, which, by the way, God doesn't perceive it to be bad, then you may take that guilt with you, you may feel guilty. So good or bad, I think it's important everybody understands, regardless of what you've done, you can forgive yourself.
And then the very important question, how did most people get away from their hellish experiences?
So most people, in most cases, the experience ended through what I call in the book a savior. So there was a really interesting article I read, and I think I included this in the book, but it was one of the first witness statements I came across, where a witness was speaking to God, and he said he saw God weeping for those in hell because he can't help them. And this is where free will comes into it, right? From a free will perspective, if you feel that you belong in hell, even if this comes back to the guilt, if you feel unworthy of heaven, and as a result you put yourself in hell, then that's your free will, right? God will not contradict your free will. So he can't help you if you don't want his help. And if you've made that decision, even subconsciously, then he can't do anything, right? As soon as you acknowledge and understand that you deserve the lie and you do not belong in hell, then that is typically when people meet their saviors. It's not always necessarily God. In these examples, it comes through and literally reaches into hell like a God ray, beam of light in some cases. In other cases, they'll just close their eyes and open their eyes and they're somewhere else in a positive environment. But there are many dramatic cases, and it manifests in different ways, right? I mean, everything is a manifestation. In hell, everything's a manifestation. Nothing is, it feels real, and it physically has the same concepts of being real, but it's not. It's a manifestation collectively of all of the souls that are there. So most people come out that way. They reach out, they call for God. It's as simple as that, calling for God, forgiving themselves, or the NDE just ends. There was a few cases, which I include in the book, where somebody ended up in hell because they couldn't complete their life review. And their life review, it's important to do that, right? Because that's where you look back at the things you've done to other people, and it's not punishment, it's not judgment. It's so you can learn from what you've done and also forgive yourself. And this is what I mean. So even if you can't forgive yourself in life, you will have another opportunity to do that in your life review. In fact, your last opportunity to do that. And most people do that, by the way. Most people can, because you're fully supported. It's a very supportive experience, more supportive than anything you could have lived on earth. But not everybody can. In very small cases, there are people that will refuse to complete their life review, because in your life review, you experience what you did to other people. You feel what they feel. You live what they lived, what you put them through. And some people can't handle that. And for those people, until because that whole life review is also a cleansing process. It cleanses your soul, almost takes you picked up here on this kind of ball of negativity that we live on. So those people can end up in hell. So to be, the most important thing is you just need to ask. You need to accept that you don't belong there. You need to accept that God loves you. Like I said, there's nothing you can do to make him love you less, but he can't help you unless you're willing to be helped. So that's how most people escape. And it's their family ones in most cases, their loved ones, that will come and rescue them from this situation.
Have you also researched how people changed through their own negative NDEs?
Yeah, yes, I have. And that comes out of the witness accounts anyway. So there's not necessarily separate studies that look into what happens when somebody comes out of their NDE, their distressing NDEs. There is, surprisingly, even with distressing NDEs, a lot of the time, it's a positive outcome for the witness. There are some cases, which is pretty frightening, where people are terrified of dying. It's limited, it's a very small number. But in some cases, when I was reading witness statements, they were having physical symptoms of fear and distress as they were writing this witness statement down, right? So they were sweating, they were struggling to breathe, they felt it's just anxiety, physical extreme anxiety, just when they're talking about their experience. So that can happen. It is rarer. In most cases, because the distressing experience ends positively, the outcome is positive. But there are many cases, and I hope that the book answers the question for people that have had these distressing experiences but still don't know why. If they read the book, I'm sure they'll find their answer as to why they had that experience. And there's a lot of people that fear that they're going to go back to hell when they die. That's just not necessarily the case, right? And the same lessons for those that have had a distressing NDE as people that have never had any NDE of any type. It's the same advice, the same guidance, the same outcome. So positive in most cases. And there are some extreme changes in people's lives when they have a near-death experience, more so than even severe life events like, a heart attack. The change in people's lives is just staggering. For distress and NDEs, it's not, if there's a positive element to it, it's pretty much the same. One of the things that I find quite surprising, and this applies both to stress and positive, is that a lot of relationships break down, marriages particularly, after an NDE. And that was quite interesting to me. And I think that people, when they come back from their near-death experience, it's like, well, life's too short to not live my best life. And people start to make changes to the things in their lives that they feel not fulfilling to them. So for distress and NDEs, it's really not that different in positive, with the exception that those experiences that ended negatively, as opposed to transitioning to a positive experience, those people live in fear. A really important thing to remember when they come back. And I really hope that anybody that sees this understands that when they have a distress and NDE, it doesn't make them a bad person. It just means that they've got some self-worth issues and guilt they need to work on, they need to work through, but it does not make them a bad person. And I would encourage anybody that's had that experience not to feel unworthy of anybody's love. And it's very important, I think, that they come forward and talk about their experience and try to understand more about it. Don't just put it away and try and forget about it. Talk to people that understand this area and try and learn from it, is what I would say. It doesn't mean it's going to happen again. And typically, even if it's negative, there's always a lesson in these experiences for positive and negative. So it's important to try and understand what that lesson is.
And have you used other possibilities to learn about hellish out-of-body states, for example, mediumship? If so, did you find any correspondences between the near-death reports and the other sources?
So not specifically. I didn't specifically look at other types, so STEs, spiritually transformative experiences, and there's lots of different types of experiences, right? I wanted to be very focused. And also there's like the circles, so your audience, for example, will be very open-minded to the various different types of spiritual experiences. Most people aren't like that, right? So most people still think that NDEs are like UFOs. It's just some kind of, it's astonishing to me really that coming at it from a scientific point of view, that there are studies, there are some good studies taking place, but really not as extensive as it should be, considering it affects every single human being on the planet. It's surprising there's not as many studies. So I focused on NDEs specifically because I wanted to make sure the book would appeal not only to those that are already convinced, already know or understand what's going to happen. They already know what's going to happen based on their own studies and looking into this subject. I want to try and reach people that maybe aren't aware of NDEs. And in order to do that, I needed to keep the subject very focused on near-death experiences. But I can still answer the question. I am aware of ST. I spoke to somebody recently who had a spiritually transformative experience. There are absolutely lots of connections between, I do believe, but I would have to do extensive research to make that belief a conclusion. There is a difference. But to conclude it, it would require more research. But I do believe, anecdotally, based on what I've read, that spiritually transformative experiences are real and that they are very similar to near-death experiences. And I believe the reason for that is various. But in many cases, a lot of people that have these experiences, they are performing some form of meditation, or they've taken some kind of 𝘂𝗶𝗍 is a very common psychedelic, and there's studies into that. And the reason I mentioned that particular drug is because it suppresses something called the ego center of the brain. It's being used in medical studies now to treat severe depression and anxiety, and it suppresses the ego center of the brain. And the ego center of the brain is your sense of you, and it's an anchor to this earth. It's an anchor it anchors your consciousness to your body, to your physical body. If you suppress or eliminate that ego center, then the idea is that you're more connected to your soul, and therefore your soul has access beyond this realm, which otherwise you wouldn't be able to do. So I do believe that STEs and mediumship and these other, I do believe that people have these abilities and have these experiences. I just haven't done extensive research into it. But based on some of the feedback I've had recently, I am considering looking into this subject a lot more in the future. Yeah, I think there's a lot of interest in hellish experiences, and there's a lot of association when it comes to hell. and anything in regards to evil, to associate that with religion and theology. And all I would say is, whenever you enter into the subject of near-death experiences, or anything when it comes to the kind of this entire subject of life and death, it's better to come with an open mind, and just the book is not a religious book. It's specifically intended not to be a religious book. I talk about religion, I talk about demonology and how it's been translated, and religion is important in terms of how hell came to be in the first place. But I would suggest, regardless of what people believe, it's still interesting to read, and it's always interesting to get another perspective on things. So I would say just come with an open mind. I've tried to be as scientific as possible, and I'd welcome any feedback. And most importantly, the book is actually a positive message that you'll see at the end. Sometimes, and I think this is really the biggest lesson of all, is that life is hard, but at the end of it, all those things we learn is very positive and necessary for us to have gone through those experiences. I think the book is very similar in that fashion, is that it's a hard read in many cases, depending on how well you can handle some of these distressing reports, but ultimately it's a journey to the light at the end. And I hope people find it interesting. And if you've had a distressing NDE, please do report it, and don't be afraid to talk about it. And as I said, always forgive yourself.
David Gerrelli, thank you very much for sharing your insights about this topic with us.
No problem, Andrew. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for your time.